So if we look at the White House's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism, this is from the White House, it looks very much like, because they're trying to prevent domestic violent extremism, DVE as it's referred to, even though they say that it's fine to have ideologies that are against capitalism, on March the 1st, 2021, the definition of domestic terrorism included in the report by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence stated that included, the domestic terrorism definition included residents who, quote, oppose all forms of capitalism, end quote. So if that's the case, then, basically anybody who is for socialism, communism, etc., anybody who is opposing imperialism, which is inextricably linked to capitalism, it all goes together, that is an anarchist. Anybody who is against this current system, because it's not just capitalism, they're also stating that they're anybody who's trying to disrupt the establishment, basically, is a terrorist. And so we knew in a way that this was going to get to this point where they were just going to outright find a way, by using the January 6th, 2021 Capitol building attack in Washington, D.C., that they were going to use that to expand domestic terrorism laws, and that would affect people beyond the far right, because that's what the U.S. government does. They use an event, whether it's 9/11, whether it's this Capitol building, the Capitol building attack. They use any event which they can then expand further repression and oppression of any dissenting voices, any dissenting movements. And you could actually include the Black Lives Matter movement, not the organization, which is problematic, but the movement that had a resurgence after the George Floyd murder by Derek Chauvin, by the state, basically. They could actually consider the Black Lives Matter protests, because they could consider them also domestic terrorism, domestic violent extremism. And that's because they, any sort of agents provocateurs that are in any of those protests can set things on fire, can turn over something, can sort of attack police, whatever. Any of that could be considered domestic violent extremism and pinned on anyone within that particular movement, anybody in that particular protest on the day. And there's also been laws where if you sort of are a part of a group and one person in that group does something that is, what they deem illegal, then the whole group is responsible. The whole group collectively is punished, can be punished under the law. And we only have to see how and I'm going to share some of the parts of this fact sheet released by the White House, which sort of can be interpreted quite broadly, and to include anybody who's anti-capitalist. I would be considered, if I lived in the US, a domestic violent extremist, because I was against that ideology, which is, as I mentioned, and which Lenin has talked about, is inextricably linked with capitalism. Imperialism is inextricably linked with capitalism. So, I'd be considered that. Most of the people who I follow that are journalists would be considered that, like Avi Martin and Mike Preisner. So I'll read some of that, but from the White House fact sheet, which is sort of disturbing. And also, there was a Newsweek article, is Joe Biden basically outlawing capitalism and considering it terrorism? I'll read a few little bits from that. So, as that song goes by Joy Division, feel it closing in, the establishment, the 1%, the capitalist class, the political class, are feeling, they're seeing that more and more young people are becoming socialist, and they see how people are linking together. These various movements are being linked together, whether it's what's happening in Palestine, the oppression of Palestinians, the apartheid state against Palestinians, which is closely connected with US imperialism because they fund all of that at a tune of $10 million a day. Or if it's, the Black Lives Matter, that protests have been putting together capitalism with and basically how they've treated the American public, the US public during this COVID outbreak, not refusing to give them, Medicare for all in a pandemic, the evictions that are coming up, the more and more homeless people, huge amounts of unhoused people now all over the United States. It's a failed state, basically. Anyway, the Black Lives Matter protests, they're putting together that. It's moved beyond George Floyd and the other people, the other black people, the many, many black people who've been lynched by the state, by the militarized police. It's gone beyond that. So there's this feeling of this closing in of where people are recognizing that the public is recognizing that that there is something very wrong, and that it is not even just one political party. It's not just the Republican Party that is problematic, that it is the duopoly, which turns out to be just one big party. They're both helping prop one another up. You only have to see how they behave with one another when they don't think cameras are on them. For example, Kamala Harris it was about 5 months ago, giving a fist bump to Lindsey Graham, unhinged war hawk Lindsey Graham. They are all friendly, just like here in Australia. A lot of the people in Parliament, a lot of politicians in Parliament are all buddies. They might do a bit of argy-bargy in Parliament with one another and look like they dislike one another, but behind the scenes they all socialized with each other, most of them. They all went to the same schools, and the same in the US. There's a lot of politicians in the duopoly. They're all outside away from the cameras. Both parties are pretty friendly, a lot of them with one another. And as you can see with Kamala Harris fist bumping Lindsey Graham, who's pushing all kinds of wars. He's never met a war he didn't like. And I would say that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have never come across a war that they didn't like. That's the whole idea of this. The US empire is to have full spectrum dominance throughout the world. Sorry, the sun is blurring out the screen. It's all just as Doug Valentine, who wrote this book about the CIA, said, that the CIA, somebody had said to him that CIA is the invisible army of capitalism. So since the US has been basically overthrowing governments left and right, particularly since 1945, after the war, when the CIA was formed in 1947, there's been 50 plus governments of various countries have been overthrown by the CIA in an attempt to basically steal resources, pillage and plunder, and then destroy the country so that they cannot get back on their feet again, install some sort of a dictator which will do the bidding of the US empire, and that's been their mission, particularly since the end of the World War II. So this is sort of these domestic terrorism laws now that are coming in, where they use this Capitol building attack, which turned out looks like it was very much an inside job inside the Pentagon, inside of the various inside the National Guard. It would look like, because of the way it turned out, it looks like it was very much an inside job. So these domestic terrorism laws have been on the books probably for a long time, and as usual, using either 9/11 as an excuse to take away civil liberties. This is also being used. This Capitol building attack is being used to take away civil liberties. And that's just how it's going to go until, it's completely fascist. As I mentioned before, the US has the US has the 14 defining characteristics of fascism. And you see it more and more. It's just like, as I've mentioned before, algae covering a pond. It starts off very slowly, then suddenly it's all over the pond. The capitalist class realize that people are waking up and that young people are turning towards socialism because capitalism has failed. It's always been meant to be inherently exploitative, and young people realize that. So they can't have that happening. They have to grip onto power, hang on to it. They feel that the center cannot hold anymore, therefore they have to bring in these they have to basically make an ideology illegal, an anti-capitalist ideology illegal, and call you a terrorist if you're against this dreadful end-stage ecocidal ideology, which is capitalism, this system which needs to end. And we won't ever see the end of war while we have capitalism, because they're linked very closely with one another. And fascism is basically end-stage capitalism in decay. So until we address these various issues, but particularly US imperialism, and expose it for what it is, this is just going to continue on. And this is what the establishment is afraid of, the state. State power is feeling very threatened right now. And this is what we're getting now. This definition of domestic violent extremism now probably includes anti-capitalist ideology. So I'm going to share some of this fact sheet by the White House, which you could interpret in all kinds of ways, really, if you want to, and they do. And it was they sought the advice of the FBI and the state police. How wonderful. And so, state police also being white supremacists, a lot of them. So that says a lot about this fact sheet. So I'll check. So I'll read you some of this and just have a little discussion about it. So if we have a look at this fact sheet, the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism, under federal law, quote, domestic terrorism, end quote, is defined as, quote, activities that involve acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of the criminal laws of the United States or any state appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of the government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, end quote. So this kidnapping in particular, the 4 activists from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, about 8 months ago now, they were protesting outside of the Denver Police Department, and they surrounded the police department, or a lot of people were there anyway. I don't know if they actually surrounded them. And now they're up for kidnapping, up on felony charges because of that. So that's just an example of probably what the state considers domestic violent extremists, those 4 activists from the Party for Socialism and Liberation. And all you need is some agents provocateurs doing some destruction, say in Portland or somewhere else. I mean, the capitalist class is very disturbed by the fact that those who own businesses, there was a 80% reduction in foot traffic in the center of Portland. It's things like that that help bring about these kinds of laws because the capitalist class don't want their profits interfered with, and so they'll find a way of lobbying government. And it doesn't take much to really convince anybody in the U.S. government to bring in measures that will squash dissent and also to frighten people into not protesting. It only takes some financial penalties against protesters, which they tend to like to do, that will deter people from wanting to engage in protests. You only have to tie people up in litigation for a few years, and that is a sort of a measure that deters anything that is protesting against the state. And this is interesting. The review was rooted in an expert assessment of the domestic terrorism threat provided by intelligence and law enforcement communities. So that's basically militarized police and the FBI and associated intelligence, in quote, sources. So it found that the 2 most lethal elements of today's domestic terrorism threat are 1, racially and ethically motivated violent extremists who advocate for the superiority of the white race. So that's basically the far right, the white supremacists like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, different ones of that nature. The Proud Boys who participated in the Capitol building attack, and any other, the QAnoners, those kinds of groups. And then the second is anti-government and anti-authority violent extremists. Well, that would be anarchists. That would be any group. So anti-authority violent extremists, such as militia violent extremists. Well, you can be anti-authority and not necessarily be part of any militia violent extremists. You can be anti-capitalist. You can be anti-government because the government is basically a international terrorist organization, really. That includes both sides of the aisle, the Democratic Party and the GOP. So, to be anti-authority and to reject the governing by basically a corporate-owned terrorist organization, that is fair enough. But of course, that is not. The U.S. is only interested in freedom of speech when it suits them, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. And this is part of the taking away, the destruction of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, just like they did with Julian Assange. They have hounded and persecuted Julian Assange for 10 years, and all he was doing was helping release leaks by Chelsea Manning, which exposed the war crimes of the state, the US empire. That's what he did, and he's been hounded and persecuted, and is still being persecuted in Belmarsh prison, and that's all he did, was expose war crimes. So you could consider that anti-government and anti-authority, just like Julian Assange did. If you're trying to expose corruption by the state, or you're trying to expose war crimes, that can be considered anti-government and anti-authority. There's so many different ways you can expand on this particular strategy, national strategy, and interpret it. There's so many different ways you can interpret it. And they are claiming here that throughout this process of consultation, quote, "we embrace the protection of civil rights and civil liberties as a national security imperative," end quote. Well, we know that that's just not true. As I said, they only protect freedom of speech often when it's to do with Nazis protesting in the streets. I mean, really, they protect freedom of speech when it suits them, when it's propping up their system, when it is interfering, like if it's anti-capitalist or if it's anti-imperialist, that's when they don't protect that speech, and they have the help of Silicon Valley to help them suppress and censor by algorithms, by these very, very powerful social media platforms, so that anti-imperialist voices cannot be heard. And eventually, I think they'll just take anti-imperialist voices off social media completely. They're doing that throughout YouTube, which is a very large platform. They're doing it on Facebook. They're taking away Palestinian rights voices. So, we can see it happening. And they've used the Capitol building attack as another attempt to further silence dissent, to further silence anyone who will interfere with their capitalist class and their profits, and interfere with their ongoing efforts to attain full spectrum dominance throughout the world through their US empire. It says here, quote, "The Department of Justice and Federal Bureau of Investigation have implemented a robust system to methodically track domestic terrorism cases nationwide." And it continues, "The Department of State, as well as the intelligence and law enforcement communities," that's basically the police and the FBI and associated intelligence, and basically Silicon Valley, are learning more from foreign partners about the international dimension of this threat. Well, basically all the Western capitalist governments are all sharing information and all working in tandem to bring down any sort of threat to their power, any sort of threat to capitalism, and that's any sort of threat to their ongoing wars. And so they're basically, Silicon Valley is in cahoots with all of that. And the Department of State will continue to assess whether additional foreign entities, that would be China and Russia, because they're in the crosshairs of US empire, linked to domestic terrorism, can be designated. I mean, the whole Russiagate thing that whole fabrication of the whole Russiagate thing, that was that's continuing on, as is basically the anti-China propaganda too, because China is in the crosshairs. So I'm sure that Iran would be thrown in there. It says as foreign terrorist organizations, or specifically designated global terrorists. That would be anybody who is basically any country that has not submitted already to the US empire would be considered any part of their efforts, to push back. It'd all be considered global terrorism. This is another way too. The Department of the Treasury, in coordination with law enforcement, is exploring ways to enhance the identification and analysis of financial activity of domestic terrorists. All you have to do is decide if someone, a leftist group that is against capitalism, that is against imperialism, if that is considered domestic terrorism, which it could be considered that, then anything where they're getting financial support from the public, if they're anti-imperialist journalists like the Empire Files, like the Grey Zone, anything like that, they can be considered, their efforts to ask the public for donations because they're viewer supported, that can be crushed by by Wall Street, basically, by these credit card and PayPal, etc. Any of those various ways that people can make donations via YouTube and the super chats, that can all be taken away from any of these, what the state considers domestic terrorists. And I do not believe that you have to be engaged in violent extremism to be considered a domestic terrorist under this strategy. I really don't. I think that they might say that in this fact sheet, but I think that if they think that it could lead to people rising up, they can consider that an incitement to violence. That's I feel like this strategy can be expanded and interpreted in many, many ways. And as we know, really there's no consistency in the way law is interpreted in the US and elsewhere, but in the US. So they've been giving a lot of money for this to be carried out. And it says here the US government will improve public awareness of federal forces to address concerning or threatening behavior before violence occurs. And you see, that's what I mean by you don't actually have to be already engaging in violence. They can consider maybe that your information that you're providing to the public is concerning or threatening behavior. See, this is how they can interpret it. So if you're providing information that they consider they can say incites violent behavior, then they can shut that down, either through preventing the various ways that people donate to those sources. They can shut that down and basically crush you that way. There's so many different ways they can crush the real left without actually arresting you. And that's already being done, with censorship on social media, with the intentional censorship by social media, and then at some point making it just deleting pages, deleting channels, and so forth. And here's where the Silicon Valley comes in. The US government will augment its efforts to address online terrorist recruitment and mobilization to violence by domestic terrorists through increased information sharing with the technology sector and the creation of innovative ways to foster digital literacy and build resilience to recruitment and mobilization. So in other words, that's just the short version of that is to engage the help of Silicon Valley, and they're quite happy to help Silicon Valley and the huge tech industry to surveil and censor, and that to prevent recruitment and mobilization. So that's just another way of saying censoring. And they're using another event like the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand to also bring in their further surveillance and suppression of civil liberties. So they've given $100 million in, and that the squad in, the AOC and all the others have actually were quite happy for further, like a huge amount, I think it was $1 billion or something, to make sure the Capitol building was safe, so that they're safe, to increase basically police presence, so much for any support of reducing and defunding the police. No. And so that's, and then this is $100 million in additional resources for the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security, to be included in the 2022 fiscal budget. So that's another injection that will help with suppression and surveillance. And this is for the Department of Justice is closely examining whether new legislative authorities that balance safety and the protection of civil liberties are necessary and appropriate. Well, good luck with that. And if they do bring in some legislative authorities that are supposed to protect civil liberties, I'm sure they'll be incredibly sloppy, and they'll have ways of circumventing any sort of real ways of protecting civil liberties. It's all just window dressing. And so they're talking about also their internal ways of making sure that they don't have far right extremists within their employees. Good luck with that. And I mean, I consider the US government a extremist terrorist group. So, what they're doing, the Department of Defense, is basically promoting terrorism all around the world, either funding terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and al-Nusra and all those quote-unquote moderate rebels, so they can continue on attacking and trying to overthrow Syria. I mean, the CIA has been involved in that, overthrowing governments since World War II. I mean, they're a terrorist empire. So it's the irony of trying to identify domestic terrorists within their ranks is funny, because they are terrorists if they're helping continue on endless wars. And this is this is just funny. If it wasn't sad, it'd be funny. Every component of the government has a role to play in rooting out racism and bigotry. Who cares about the racism overseas that they're engaged in when they're invading countries left and right, destroying families, destroying the country like they did with Libya, like they're doing in Syria, and so forth, Iraq, Afghanistan, the list goes on. I mean, it's just full-on white supremacist, racist terrorism. So, it's just ridiculous, making out as if this is where you get the woke Biden administration and the woke CIA all pretending like they care about the lives of black people and people of color and LGBT people and so forth, all the different minority groups. But it's just all a thin veneer that covers up a white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist, terrorist state going around, a terrorist organization going around the world and basically destroying black and brown people all over the world, their lives and their countries. And also, as the US has been engaged for many, many decades now, vilifying and trying to suppress and destroy anything that is socialist and communist. They've been doing that now for over a century. Anything that is against capitalism is considered a threat. The US government is committed to strengthening trust in American democracy and its ability to deliver to the American people, including through relief and opportunity provided by, and they go through all the different plans that are supposed to help the US citizens. The US government will also work to find ways to counter the polarization often fueled by disinformation and misinformation and dangerous conspiracy theories online. So they're basically using the whole QAnon thing, the whole unhinged QAnon conspiracy theory, and what helped actually fuel the Capitol attack and all of that. They're using that as a way also of talking about disinformation and misinformation, which is really another way of saying anything that counters the US national security state narrative, anything that is countering their imperialist efforts overseas, would be considered disinformation and misinformation, and also that it is considered dangerous, and that will also be considered domestic terrorism, considered a domestic violent extremism. Anything that is going to interfere with their efforts to pillage and plunder overseas and destroy countries and have full spectrum dominance, that will be considered terrorism. And disinformation and misinformation, that's another way of saying leftist independent journalism. So that's that particular one. And in this, he says, James Crump said, the strategy adds that the groups, quote, may be motivated to violence by single-issue ideologies related to abortion, animal rights, environmental or involuntary celibate violent extremism, as well as other grievances or a combination of ideological influences. So that just about covers everything, doesn't it? And that part about animal rights, that is, and I don't agree with these tactics, because usually the groups that go into these various quote-unquote factory farms usually don't overtly and front and center promote veganism, which is the way to end any form of animal use, including industrialized farming, which is widespread, even the free-range, enriched cages and so forth. It's all industrialized. So industrialized or quote-unquote factory farming is never going to end while we have people who are not vegan. It's just a simple matter of demand and supply. So going into factory farms, quote-unquote, is a pointless exercise, really, because all animal use is abusive. There's no such thing as non-abusive use of animals, whether it be in industrialized settings, which is mainly what it is now, or whether it's on a mom and pop farm. It's all abusive. So anybody who really understands that animals, sentient animals, deserve the right not to be used as resources, that are truly vegan, and the ethical sense of that word, know that that it's not how we use animals that is the problem. It's that we use them at all that's the problem. So I'm not really a big, I don't really think we need any more awful videos of what's happening to animals. There's thousands and thousands of videos online of that. There's more than enough information. We don't need people to be breaking into quote unquote factory farms anymore to get information of what's going on. We know it's all wrong. We know it's all abusive. We know that that if we really truly believe animals morally matter, we need to stop that. We need to become vegan. So I don't really think that, I know that that's animal rights, animal in quotes, rights in quotes groups. Usually they promote welfare, so I don't consider them rights groups. But those groups that have been breaking into these quote unquote factory farms and who don't promote veganism as well or put it down, like Direct Action Everywhere, that kind of group, I don't believe they're necessary to, and I know that they've been considered, that those groups have been considered terrorist groups by the state because it's interfering with profits by the very large and very powerful animal agriculture industries. But as I say, I don't think it's necessary for that to happen. I don't think we need any more of that information. But it's really unfortunate, of course, that is considered terrorism. So that's been on the terrorist list by the FBI for at least 10 years now, way back when I was in 2009 or 2010, I think. So anyway, but this is interesting. Environmental groups, incels, it's all put together. I mean, here you've got environmental activists put together in the same group as incels who are doing mass shootings and killing, on a regular basis. Or far-right groups that are white supremacist far-right groups. So we've got animal quote-unquote rights groups and environmentalists in the same group as far-right extremists that are committing mass murders. I mean, this is where we're at now. And at the end here, or a combination of ideological influences. So you could be a vegan environmentalist. You could be a vegan and environmentalist, and you could be anti-capitalist. Well, you're covering a whole bunch of what they consider problematic to the state. And, you could be considered at some point with your information you're providing, you're inciting others to violence. I mean, when it push comes to shove and the capitalist class has taken everything away from people in the US and other countries join in on that, which they're doing in Western countries, and basically through neoliberalism, which is an expression of an expression of fascism. If you take away everything from the public, eventually there's going to be violence, and that's when they're going to say, "See, they're domestic extremists, domestic terrorists that need to be put down." So eventually, all of us, if when everything is taken away from us through neoliberalism, we're all going to be considered domestic terrorists.
History actually evolved. SOCDEMs never addressed the conflicting material. Yes, thank you. That divides people into classes, the inherent contradiction of capitalism. Absolutely. So all this is to say that Bernie Sanders is like the modern version of populist recuperation of, what anti-capitalist ideologies like communism and socialism and anarchism, because he knows that people are pissed off and left out by capitalism. But he wants us to believe, and look, by the way, I voted for Bernie Sanders.
We made a stream for Bernie Sanders.
Bernie Sanders changed my entire worldview in a lot of ways. Got me started with anti-capitalism. I even, I donated a lot of my personal money to Bernie when he ran in 2015 and during the primary last time. So, but that all being said, all along I've always, since I became a communist. So like in the 2020 election, I said throughout the primary, like the only reason that I want Bernie to win the second go around was because he would be like the best enemy for us to have. you know, because we get to choose, you know, try to choose our own enemy or whatever. But like, he is absolutely a populist and absolutely trying to recuperate class conflict to preserve capitalism. That's what Bernie Sanders is doing, AOC, the whole squad, all of these SOCDEMs.
Yeah.
They think that we can build a kinder, gentler form of capitalism, and they think that we can like tame capitalism so that the working class can live in harmony with the capitalist class, but they don't want to actually get rid of capitalism. And I've had so many arguments with people about this, but Bernie Sanders had said explicitly many times he doesn't want to get rid of capitalism. He's praised capitalism. Some people think that he's like hiding his power level and he's a crypto communist or whatever. Whatever, if that's true or not materially, it hasn't manifested in anything that has actually led to any kind of revolutionary activity. I think that Bernie Sanders is maybe I'm glad Bernie Sanders existed because he normalized terms like socialism. He got me to start questioning capitalism. But we as communists and anarchists and leftists and socialists, whatever you want to call yourself, it's our job. Again, like Lenin said, and I'm saying this as an anarchist, but like Lenin said, it's our job to point out these bourgeois salesmen, which I think Bernie Sanders is a bourgeois salesman. It's our job to understand their rhetoric and their arguments, and then enough so that we can attack their arguments. And I don't mean like a debate way, but I mean like so that we can dialectically, pedagogically train the working class to understand that that kind of idealistic utopian populism is a dead end, and that we truly need a materialist and a revolutionary movement that will go far beyond anything Bernie Sanders wants. Okay, I'm done.
Basis, and it was done in order to terrify people, to scare people, and to send a message that if you engage in social justice activism, you are risking life and limb to come out. And they certainly believed that this would chill and crush the movement, and it had the opposite effect. More people came out the next day, and more the day after, and more people joining from all walks of life. Because when people see this kind of extreme, outrageous, grotesque, and visceral types of oppression, people who care and demand justice are going to stand up and fight back, and that's what's happening now. We all need to take that message and send it back. And our message back must be that we will not be afraid, that we will stand up, we will fight and stand alongside and join in the racial justice movement, that those who have been in the streets for months and for years are not going back inside, and that for others who have never come out, this is the time to come out. Because across the country, people are being arrested who are engaged in peaceful protest, and protesters are being demonized. That is always part and parcel of these kinds of attacks. There is an extreme effort to demonize demonstrators, to claim people are rioters, to suggest that people somehow deserve what's coming to them. We know it's not true. We're seeing exactly what's happening on the ground. And the only way to fight back is for more and more people to demand justice. The government is hoping that this type of attack not only will impact and affect those who are being threatened with jail time, those who are wrongfully arrested, those who are going to be fighting to free, but that it will impact everyone else. This is part of the entire initiative that we've seen from the federal government, with the deployment of federal troops, with paramilitary units into Portland, with the threatened deployment of paramilitary units elsewhere across the country. And it is only because this movement is so incredibly powerful. It is shaking the foundations of institutional racism. It is shaking the foundations of the police and the police apparatus and the police structure that causes so much damage and that has gone unchallenged for so long, at least unchallenged by this number of people in the United States who are forcing and demanding change. So the number one thing that we can't do is be afraid. We can't go back inside. And we have to stand and fight and help anyone that gets targeted, wrongfully targeted by these prosecutors and these police who are doing everything they can to shut down the movement. That's what we're committed to doing, is to stand in defense of the racial justice movement. It won't back down, and all of us who are standing together, we won't back down.